We are going to transition into our sermon series, Unhurried. It is a wonderful series right now, especially because we're entering into a new year and life is just nuts. There's things going on. We're all thinking through, okay, what's coming up? We got to get back into the kids' schedules and sports and everything else. And it's really easy to just start being so busy again. But this month, let's try to slow down. Try to figure out what's most important in this life. And so today, Pastor Kevin is going to come up and join us and continue on this Unhurried series.
Thanks, Nathaniel. Thanks, Josh. 25 years ago, I stepped out of the business world and onto staff at a church, and there were a lot of adjustments that took place in my life, and one of those was shifting from a typical, what I thought of as typical Monday through Friday schedule to adding weekend responsibilities. And I was supposed to be off on Fridays and Saturdays, but what invariably ended up happening is my wife and I led a young married ministry at the time, and it typically had events that would occur either on a Friday or a Saturday. And so over time, my week quickly filled up to where I was many weeks working 6 or 7 days a week. Now, I didn't really notice it at the time, but one of the things I appreciate about my wife is she is pretty straight with me. And so I don't have to guess what she's thinking. And so she came to me at some point and she's like, hey, this schedule's not working for me. We have 3 little kids. And the truth was, it wasn't working, or it wouldn't have worked for me over the long haul. And so I had to make some adjustments. I had to be more intentional about stepping out of work and ministry. And I wish I could tell you that I learned that lesson then. I did a bit, but it's a lesson that I continue to learn and explore over and over. And in the past year, I would say I've gotten probably the most intentional I've ever gotten about trying to set aside specific times of rest. And I can tell you more about that, but I think the reality for all of us is because of all that we've got to do in our lives, taking time to slow down and rest feels counterintuitive. But this ancient practice, which is often called Sabbath, is actually a vital part of following Jesus today. It's not a relic from the past, but it's something that's important to our lives, our health, and just all of who we are. Now, there can be a lot of reactions to this term or this idea of taking rest, or if you particular this idea of Sabbath. And if you grew up in a church or a family where people took this very strictly and it was practiced almost legalistically, you might have a little bit of a negative reaction. Or you might have a reaction that says, that feels impossible to me because my life is so busy, and just maybe your temperament, you find it hard to slow down and to take a break. And, I would say I've heard the term mom guilt recently. I think that's a real thing. I think if you're a mom, sometimes it's really hard to just slow down and kind of let things go for a moment. And then there are probably those of you who are intrigued, but you understand the challenge of actually doing this. Well, if anybody ever had an excuse for not taking a break, for not taking a day off, it was probably the man who was busy saving the world, Jesus. And so we're going to take a look at what Jesus had to say about this idea of Sabbath and how he practiced it to understand its true significance. And so would you grab a Bible or fire up your Bible app? We're going to be in Mark chapter 2. It's on page 831. If you're using one of our Bibles, it's underneath or in front of you. And it builds on what we talked about last week. We talked from the Gospel in Matthew chapter 11 where Jesus invited people. He said, come to me, those of you who are weary and heavy laden. And he invited us to find rest in him. And this story builds on that because Matthew actually captures the same story. It's right after Jesus offered that invitation, but we're actually going to look at the Mark version of the story. There's a lot in this story. I don't have time to cover it all, but they're going to cover a couple of key points. So in Mark chapter 2, verses 23 and 24, we see this. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees said to Jesus, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath? Now, let me pause here for a moment and give a little background. So the Sabbath was what we would call Saturday. It was a special day for the Jews. We'll talk about why that was. And the Pharisees was a pressure group. They were serious about following the Jewish law. And this group existed as a reaction because there were times in Israel's history where people had not followed the laws. They hadn't taken them seriously. And so the Pharisees existed because they were very strict about following the law. In fact, they were so serious about it that they added a lot of rules to their own. And there were times that the law would define things, and maybe it wasn't exactly clear in all the details, and so they would add rules or they would define what God meant by whatever he said. So for instance, God gave them a law that said you weren't supposed to work. And so they added a lot of rules and they defined what work looked like. And that work included harvesting a field. And so they define what Jesus' disciples are doing that day as working. Now, I think Jesus understood, and probably what I would say is they were actually going for a walk and they were having a snack. And often the Pharisees meant well, but they kind of tended to get caught up in their own rules, and they lost sight of why God gave the law in the first place. And so in verse 27, we see Jesus remind them of why the Sabbath exists. And he says to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. You see, Jesus isn't saying that Sabbath isn't important, but he is saying the first thing that we need to understand about this idea of Sabbath, and that's simply this. Sabbath is a gift to humanity. Now, Jesus emphasized this idea that it was a gift to provide rest and renewal, that it wasn't a burdensome rule. But I think we need to kind of pause here and say, well, why doesn't it always feel like a gift? And we've talked about some of the reasons, but one of the reasons may be it was originally given as a commandment. And we're going to jump back for a little bit more context of why they understood or how they understood this idea of Sabbath. And we're going to go Old Testament this morning, and we're going to look at Exodus chapter 20. And again, if you're using one of our Bibles, it's on page 63. And this was given as a command, and it's actually fourth of what is commonly known as the Ten Commandments. Now again, just a reminder of why God gave these commands. God wasn't trying to be a killjoy. What he was trying to do is help the people experience life. It's a little bit like as a parent, when my kids were little, there were things that I would say, hey, don't do this or do this. And they were things that, again, I was trying to help them learn what was good for them. And sometimes that included setting up boundaries, things that they wouldn't do for themselves. And so in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, we see this. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Now, holy is not a word that we often use, but it simply means to set something apart. Now, a simple example for me is when I was growing up, we had a set of dishes that were our ordinary dishes. With three boys in the house that were rather active, my mom was not going to let anything really nice be available to us. But she had a set of dishes that were holy, if you want to use that term. They were set apart. They were the china that she and my dad had received as wedding gifts. And of course, the thing I think is funny about her fine china, it was so set apart that she never actually used it. In fact, I never saw it until it was given to one of my daughters. So it was very set apart. But that's all that word means. It's set apart as something special. And we see this as we continue to read. And it says, you have 6 days each week for your ordinary work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. So there's the ordinary days that we live throughout the week. And then there's this idea that there's a special day that God has set apart. And we get our second idea in this. Sabbath is about worship, and it's about worshiping in time instead of a place. Now, let me explain that a little bit. If you think about ancient cultures, they would typically say they would have a temple or an altar. There would be a place that you would go to worship God or the gods. But for the Jews, that place changed throughout the course of their history. They had a temple or a sort of portable temple that was a synagogue. Eventually, they had a permanent temple. But even when that temple was destroyed, they would still gather and worship. And the place never changed, or the place did change, but the time that they worship never did. The seventh day for them was always set apart as a special time to worship God. And we see the same thing that's true in the church today. You see churches that meet in dedicated buildings like ours. You might see a church in a movie theater or in a school like we did for a few years. Or you see churches that gather in homes, particularly in parts of the world where people can't worship publicly. But the common denominator is there's a time set aside where people come together to worship God. Now again, there's a little more here, and so we read this in the rest of verse 10. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there is an element of justice to God's practice of the Sabbath. In fact, as you explore Sabbath throughout the Old Testament, you see this. But you see that the whole household is supposed to slow down. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic status. This isn't just something that was set aside. Even the servants in the house were invited to rest and to celebrate Sabbath. And there was even care for creation as animals were allowed to rest on that day. And that really takes us to our third idea, and it's one we've been talking about through this, but Sabbath is about rest. Now, last week I encouraged people to check out this book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. And he has this great quote that explains this idea. It says, the word Sabbath comes to us from the Hebrew Shabbat. The word literally means to stop. The Sabbath is simply a day to stop working, to stop worrying, to stop wanting, to just stop. Now again, you have to remember the context of where these people came from, because this was a pretty revolutionary idea that God gave them. They had just left slavery in Egypt, where they had been required to work 7 days a week, nonstop, never a break. And God wants them to understand that that kind of life isn't good for them. And so he gives them a space to slow down, to rest, to worship him, to practice thankfulness, and to practice trusting in him. And this idea of resting and trusting is a part of a new identity that God is giving them. Now, we see this commandment about Sabbath show up for the first time in Exodus 20, but it actually has an even older origin than this. And if you go way, way back, and we're not going to turn there because it's included in this passage, the template comes actually from the creation story that we see in Genesis. And the writer, or Moses, the writer, summarizes this in verse 11, where he says, in 6 days, the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. But on the seventh day, he rested. And that is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he set it apart as holy. And so the creation of this world, it's described in terms of days. And when we get into the seventh day, we see this image that God rested. Now, I don't think God was worn out from creating after 6 days, but the idea is he stopped. And this word can mean to stop or to cease, but it also can mean to pause or to settle down or leave something alone and not bother it. And I get this image that God rested, and he actually viewed this thing that he had made, and we know from the creation story that he called it good. But I think there's another word that I think we could use, and I think this is an important part as we think about Sabbath practice, and it's the word delight. I think God delighted in what he had made. And so Sabbath is about rest, but it's also about delight. And I think the idea is to rest so that we can delight. And there's probably a lot of words that we could have used. I could have said Sabbath is about rest and worship, but I didn't choose that because while I think worship is a part of it, I think it would have been easy to hear, well, Sabbath is just about showing up to church. I think joy is another word that we could use here. Joy is something we experience in spite of our circumstances, and I think God invites us to rest and to experience joy even in the midst of a broken world. And I think there's also an idea of play in here, enjoying something just purely for its own sake. But I think delight captures this word or this idea the best. And this idea of delight I got from reading this book, and I wanted to share a quote from this book. I wish I could, there's so much I wish I could share from this book, but it says this, and it's by a writer, Dan Allender, and he said this. He said, "The Sabbath is an invitation to enter delight. Sabbath is the holy time where we feast, play, dance, have sex, sing, pray, laugh, tell stories, read, paint, walk, and watch creation in all of its fullness." Now, as soon as I said the word sex, probably some of you were paying attention a little bit more differently. But there are a lot of things that capture delight. There are a lot of things, and one of the things that he does in this book is he says we're not very good at resting, but we're even worse at delighting in things. Because I think a lot of times when we rest, what we do is we just distract ourselves. And we find things to do that just kind of occupy our time. And what Dan says God invites us to do is to delight. That includes worship, but it includes so much more. And then there's one final idea that I think it's important for us to wrap our minds around when we talk about this idea of Sabbath. Sabbath is a concept that can be applied daily or weekly or even in longer time periods, yearly. And if you look at the life of Jesus, he did all of these things. You see, he would slip away often in the morning before he began a busy day, and he would spend time worshiping or resting in his heavenly Father's presence. He would celebrate the Sabbath every Saturday. And then you see other times where he would retreat, and he did this as he began his ministry. He escaped and just spent 40 days by himself. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about when have I experienced Sabbath, and one of the ways that I've experienced it was not on a simple Saturday, but it was on a retreat that I went on, a retreat called Encounter that I did a couple of times in Colorado a couple of years ago. And as I began to reflect, I realized it's not the place, but it was the fact that I set aside a chunk of time to encounter God in this myth, because those retreats have since moved from Colorado. Now, Colorado is a great place to experience God, but they've since moved to Indiana, and I'm hearing the same stories. And by the way, guys, there's a retreat coming up in February. It's probably filling up fast, but if you're curious about that, I'd love to talk to you if you'd like to escape and get some time to encounter God. But we're not limited to doing Sabbath on a single day. But when we have a regular practice of Sabbath on a regular time every week, it helps us rest and delight during the rest of our week as well. And so during the rest of the time, I'm going to focus on this idea of a regular weekly Sabbath. Now, for the Jews, this is what it looked like. It would actually begin on sundown on Friday night, and it would end on sundown on Saturday night. And they would prepare in advance, they would prepare meals and have everything ready. And then as Sabbath began, they would light candles. There was a little bit of a welcoming of the time or marking the time. And then they would gather for a special meal with family and friends. They would, on Saturday, they would attend synagogue where they would read prayers and they would read their scriptures, and they wouldn't do any work. They would simply rest and delight. And if you want a glimpse of this being practiced, I would encourage you to watch the TV series, The Chosen. There's several images of that in it. But while we're no longer under the law, most of us are not Jewish, we're not under law, a regular practice of Sabbath, of intentional rest and delight is crucial to our lives. And so what does it look like for us to practice that today? And so I want to look at these first three ideas on Sabbath and begin to talk about what might it look like for us to celebrate this. And the first, this idea of it being a gift, it's just a perspective shift for some of us. We have to remind ourselves that this isn't a command. It is, but it's primarily a gift that God gives us to take us to set aside time. And then the second thing is that it's going to happen in a time rather than just a place. And a time requires some intentionality. It requires some planning. It's not just going to happen in our lives. And then, lastly, this idea of rest and delight. Because God has made us all individually, the way we practice Sabbath is going to look different for every one of us because our jobs are different and how God has wired you is different. And so the ways that we practice Sabbath are different as well. And I did something for this message that I've not done often before. I emailed our members and I said, share with me, what does it look like for you to practice Sabbath? And I was a little bit, I've never crowdsourced a message before, but did it this time. And I was really surprised and pleased. I had almost 40 people respond. And so if you responded, thank you. And I had to abbreviate much of what got shared. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to share some ideas of the ways that people practice rest and delight. Jim likes to start the day slowly, meditating and thinking Godward thoughts. Janine said this, rest means to physically sit in my comfy prayer chair in our sunroom where I keep my prayer journal, Bible, and books. There are times when I literally just look out the windows to think and to listen. For Elaine and Jan, they don't do ordinary chores on Sunday, including shopping or laundry, and Elaine also takes a nap. So this idea of some literal rest, I think, is important, especially for many of us if we're not getting it during the week. Grant talked about getting a good night's sleep, and Rick stayed with the same idea. He likes to take a nap and watch sports, and as I can attest, you can do both at the same time. For Jason and Josie, this is what their Sabbath looks like. To the best of our ability, we don't schedule anything on Sundays beyond worshiping in person with our church family. We love to linger in the lobby and catch up with friends. Jason cooks a big brunch, and we spend time together as a family. We have a rule in our house called DSPT, meaning it's definitely sweatpants time. And when somebody calls DSPT, we all get comfy in comfy pants and relax. For Tom and his wife, they recharge and catch up over breakfast and coffee and linger over meaningful conversation. Another Jason said he enjoys having nothing on his schedule and going with the flow throughout the day. And as the family, they rest by making a cooked meal together in the evening, enjoying a movie together. Dinu rests with her family when she and her husband and kids do something small like eating or chatting or listening to their daughter play piano. For Cindy, rest looks like stepping away from electronics, phone, laptop, computer. For Jennifer, she practices Sabbath on Saturday through Sunday afternoon and said, I do not check my work email because it gives my mind room to rest from work, and I'm more present in my real life and Sunday morning worship. Now, for many people that responded, attending church together and his time of worship was a part of that Sabbath. Lauren said that. She says she keeps Sunday mainly for church and time with family. Fred, a grandfather, said a great joy is when part of the family can attend church with me. And that idea of worship even continues after Sunday morning. Cindy talks about talking with her family about Sunday service and things that they learned related to their faith. Another common theme was this idea of worship, music. It's probably one of the most popular. Marilyn and Jordan and many others mentioned this. And then many referenced singing, including Susanna Kelly. Brantley said she sings in the car with her daughter. And I love this. Joey said he likes to sing the same songs until I believe them. Think about that. Paul said, I seek rest with the Lord as I read the scriptures. Meditating on the word is the best way to find peace and solace in whatever circumstances I face. And then I'm going to shift more into this idea of delight. Mary Beth said, delight and joy is wrapped up in our Sunday family lunches, which included extended family. We sit around the table, we share stories of the week, we laugh, we celebrate wins, as well as life events. And Harrison says, delight and joy come from playing board games with family on quiet and unhurried days. Susanna enjoys self-care like adding an extra step in skincare or lighting a candle. She also keeps a gratitude journal. Lauren mirrored that idea and practices gratitude and seeing where she sees God at work. Sue loves to read or play word games. And then there are many that are more active in their celebration of Sabbath. Rick said, I enjoy getting out on a kayak to enjoy the stillness of the water, or he enjoys a YouTube video of a nature scene. Chris likes to watch gardening videos or learning to play the piano. He also paints with his kids as they listen to music. Another Chris says, Sabbath involves manual activity with my hands and allowing my mind to rest on his farm. Pam mirrored that idea. She refreshes her soul by getting outside and doing yard work, and she made this clear, without other people. So she's obviously an introvert. Joey likes to ride his mountain bike. Jason likes to be on the golf course and enjoy the beauty and the birds. I do not find golf resting because I'm a terrible golfer. And then a lot of people combine on Sabbath. It was walking and something else. For Malcolm, it was getting outside and going for a walk and praying. For Faith, it was going on a walk and enjoying creation. And she said a conversation with God always ensues. Heather had a similar idea, but she also included music. But she said, at other times, I leave the music off and turn on my listening ears, taking in whatever God has to tell me on that day. Kelly and Jordan experience joy when they go on walks with family or friends. And Jody and Johan said this, we take walks and we go to the grocery store because we both work from home and spend most of the time in the house, so it gets us out of the house and into the community. Eugene talked about a special Sabbath that he celebrates periodically. He'll take a 3-hour silent retreat at Shade State Park. He said different things begin to happen as the GPS stops directing and the Holy Spirit starts leading. And then my friend Rudy said this. He said, for me, rest isn't found in the absence of activity, but the presence of God's peace. The truth is that Sabbath rest and delight is going to look different for each one of us. And as we practice it, the focus shouldn't be on, did I do this right? But it should be an exploration, and we should think about, did the time really refresh my soul? Did I find delight? And it really is something that we have to learn how to do. Now, we've all got to start someplace, and I read another quote, or want to share another quote from John Mark Comer, where he says this. He said, ideas are just the beginning. Unless they move from your mind into your body, they don't become reality. And so every week of this series, we're going to give you one challenge that we're going to ask you to practice. And some of you have stopped me and said, hey, I practice 3 minutes of silence each day, so I want to encourage you to do that, and you can continue that if you want, but here's my challenge for this week. It's to pick a time to spend at least 2 hours resting and delighting. Now, I said 2 hours because I think 2 hours will stretch you. For some of you, if you can't slow down, 2 hours might be a long time. Now, you can pick a longer time or a shorter time, but I want you to think about what brings you rest and what brings you delight and intentionally practice it. And this might be something that you do individually, or if you're a family, you might figure out how to do this together with your family. Now, I wanted to share one final story as I wrap up this message. My wife, she's not here this weekend. If you're watching online, there's nothing. It's good we can laugh. That's part of resting. But one of the families that emailed me shared their practice of doing this, and it was a little longer, and I thought this is a great way to wrap up the message because this is something that they've been doing for over a year now. And it's Justin and Jen shared this. It says, we decided as a family to institute a weekly Sabbath last January after reading The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. When we saw that our 10-year-old made a New Year's resolution to have a tech-free day each week. For us, the goals were to slow our pace, spend more time together as a family, and break our reliance on devices. Although we didn't want to be legalistic, we did have a few guidelines. Justin wouldn't do any work for his small business. We wouldn't use our iPhones and iPads, and we would only watch TV or movies if it was as a whole family. Starting in January was hard. Justin's business was the busiest it had ever been. He didn't want to give up a full day of working. The kids were bored and bickered with each other. It felt like we were stuck in the house with nothing to do. And again, if the weather's like it is, if it was like it is now, I can see why they would feel that way. After our first Saturday Sabbath, no one wanted to continue, but we knew this would ultimately be good for our souls, so we persisted somewhat begrudgingly. Slowly, we found new ways to spend our time. I was amazed at the number of times that I wanted to reach for my phone out of boredom, but I replaced that with reading. The kids played with toys that had been forgotten. They built Legos and stretched their creativity. We baked and learned new board games and checked out local coffee shops around the city. As the weather warmed, we spent more time outside and discovered fun activities throughout the north side. Eventually, we looked forward to our Saturdays and the breath it created in the midst of our lives. During the past year, our family has grown closer and created lots of new, fun memories together. We also experienced God's provision as Justin's business still thrived. The margin also helped our perspective. When 99% of things can wait until the next day, nothing feels quite as urgent, and there's more time to invest in things that are life-giving without guilt. Of course, a rhythm like this still is a work in progress. We have to fight hard against a culture that always is shouting more and wears busyness as a badge of honor. And during the past few months of 2024, we didn't do this well and drifted away from the original intention of Sabbath. However, because we'd spent the time slowing and simplifying, our souls realized that something wasn't right and we needed to reset. This idea of Sabbath isn't just a command, it's a gift. And we've experienced through our family's journey slowing down and embracing rest, even when it seems counterintuitive. It has led to greater flourishing in our lives. Though it was difficult at first and still continues to be at times, the struggle to pause reveals how much we have been driven by distractions and busyness. For us, Sabbath continues to be a reminder that rest is not just about stopping, but creating space for what truly matters.